Dear Magdalena, dear Mia, dear Adrian, dear guests and fellows, I'd like to welcome you most warmly to tonight's evening, Decoding the Myths of Silicon Valley. It's one of the gifts of this house that we don't only have the most charming fellows and speakers, but also a wonderful audience. And so I would like to greet and welcome especially Consul Stefan Schneider and Ulrich Rosenow, also a number of close friends of our house, especially our colleagues from Villa Aurora, and of course the Thomas Mann House Fellows. Heike Powell recently arrived, an American scholar from Nuremberg and Munich, Klaus Leggevi, a political scientist, and Birte Meyer will join us also in a minute, a journalist from Second German Television. It's great to have you all here, enriching this place. Today's conversation is one I'm particularly looking forward to. Our guest, Mia Daub, founded a list of 100 brilliant women in AI ethics 3 years ago. Her belief is that we can't talk about tech without inclusion of women and other groups who have been marginalized in the tech sector. Mia wants to rewrite the narrative of Silicon Valley, and I'm very curious what we learn about that this evening. I'm also thrilled to welcome Adrian Daub. He did not only recently publish the furious bestseller, What Tech Calls Thinking. I can really recommend it as a literature for you over the weekend or the holidays. Adrian also focuses in his research at Stanford on various topics and interests which are key and central for us here at the Thomas Mann House. The legacy of German exile, music theory, and also contemporary political discourse. It's truly an honor to have both of you here tonight as our guests. Our fellow Magdalena Kröner will gratefully lead our conversation today, and before I hand it over to her, I would like to briefly introduce her. As an essayist and art critic, Magdalena works in Düsseldorf and New York. Her works appeared already at Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Die Zeit, or Monopol. Since 2016, she focuses increasingly on the semantics and ethics of digital culture and technologies. She just started a new series of essays for the magazine Kunstforum International, Digital Bodies, the New Image of Man at the Interface of Technology, Art, and Politics. Before I close, I'd like to thank some of our colleagues who work hard in the background to make this event possible, especially my dear colleague Benno Herz, but also Elena Dexter, Betty Ramirez, and Josephine Klaus. I wish you a wonderful evening.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction, Nikolai. And I'm very grateful to be here, I have to say, because given the past 18 months, and I think we all feel this, it's such a privilege to be here and to share the space with you and to share the space with my wonderful guests. I'm very happy to have you. And I'm really excited about tonight's discussion. And I would like to start without further ado to talk a bit more about our guests. So Mia Daub, as we heard already, is the CEO of Lighthouse 3, a strategic research and advisory firm based in Oakland, California. Mia advises large organizations on responsible innovation at scale with new and emerging tech like artificial intelligence. She has a successful track record of leading complex cross-functional programs at the intersection of business, data, and governance for global companies. And I'd be very interested to learn more about that, about these larger abstract terms. Mia is also the founder, as we heard before, of the initiative Global Women in AI Ethics. She's the creator of the annual 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics list, and also the online, it's happening on December 2nd, the online summit, 100 Brilliant Women in AI, a big gathering really of women in this very specific field all around the world. And if you haven't signed up for this, I think it's going to be very interesting. And she's also, so Women in AI Ethics Online is like a directory. It's not only an initiative, it's a directory of, and the leading source for recognition and recruitment and empowerment of women in this space. Adrian Daub, we already saw his book, is a professor of comparative literature and German studies at Stanford University. He's the director of Stanford's program of feminist gender and sexuality studies. His research is very much on intersections of tech, literature, music, philosophy in the 19th century. He is a prolific author, especially in the German language space, but also in the US, of course. He's the author of several books published by academic presses. His writing appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, most of the German dailies, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And so this is his recent book is What Tech Calls Thinking. And what I found interesting about the book is that it's really an exploration into the area of where Silicon Valley is interspersed with myths. So myths like, or rather large topics, large words like innovation, disruption, failure, desire, things that we all heard, that we're all kind of comfortable with, that we're all kind of familiar with from also like a pop cultural discourse. But then a lot of these issues, a lot of these topics have become deeply problematic. And I'm very curious to talk to both of my guests today about why that is and what could be done about it. And I think it would be nice to start with the notion of innovation. Innovation is a word. Let me just get this. Okay. So Adrian, you've highlighted that the myth of innovation is something that is prevalent in Silicon Valley's founder culture. And coming from the fine arts, coming from the art section where I'm from, I was thinking about the notion of the avant-garde. I mean, the avant-garde has been the central driver of innovation and progress, not only aesthetically, but also commercially for most of the 20th century, for most of the art market, for most of fine arts in general. And being here and speaking to a younger generation of students, of academics, I realized that the idea of the avant-garde is something that is now really like from a very young generation, and you might know more about this being in touch with students every day. It's now being disregarded. It's regarded as deeply problematic, and it's so a younger generation working in the arts looks at news stories, looks at like reevaluating historic stances, historic stories, and also the notion, the trope of innovation has become deeply problematic in the tech section. And Mia, you famously said, in Silicon Valley, we drink our own Kool-Aid. And Adrian, you said, I quote, people love to pat themselves on the shoulder for creating all these shiny new things that are in fact not so new, and one might argue, not even things. And I would love for both of you to elaborate a bit on the term of innovation. What does innovation really mean in this larger context? And how did it turn from a per se positive thing into something that's deeply problematic on so many levels right now, if we look at Silicon Valley?
Sure, I'm happy to. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here, and it's been lovely to meet Adrian as well. So in 2013, I was at the airport picking up some magazines for a business flight. This was back in the day, and I picked up MIT Review. And I still have the physical copy with me, and I hold on to it as a reminder, because the cover of this magazine has a picture of Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, and the caption said, "Buzz Aldrin would like a word with you. I asked for Mars colonies, and all I got was Facebook." So innovation has become, it's become a somewhat of a silly term, if you will, if you look at it from the perspective of an outsider and you think, how game-changing is this idea? And you realize it all comes down to, what does the VC think is going to be his ROI, his return on investment? And you fast forward to that today, and you look at what is being funded in the name of innovation, the climate change crisis. And one of the biggest takeaways is we are not funding what is most sustainable, what's most innovative, what's most effective. What we are actually funding is what some investor thinks is going to give the biggest bang for the buck. You think about big world problems. To Buzz Aldrin's point, we could be solving global hunger. We could be solving for poverty, homelessness, and instead we choose to focus on things that are more the bright, shiny objects. And I'd like to share an example, and I'm not sure if you covered that in your book. It's a product called Juicero.
Oh no, but I should have. Yes, I remember it very well.
It's my favorite example of innovation in the Valley, and anytime I feel like anybody gets excited about, oh, isn't this wonderful, I just send them a link to Juicero, and I'll tell you why. Has anyone in the audience heard about this product? Yeah. So this was back again, I feel like 2015, and this product was a juicer. So say you're Elon Musk or you're a billionaire, you have chefs, and you have army of people who get you juice in the morning, cook everything. God forbid you have to lift one finger to do anything for yourself, right? But for the rest of people who are aspiring, who are busy people, they need somebody to deliver them fresh juice every morning. So Juicero is a $699 juicer that you can use for fresh juice every morning. But the catch is it did actually use fresh fruits. So you had to buy these juice packets that go into the juicer. And then you hit a button, voila, fresh juice. And there was a big flaw. And a journalist discovered it. You could actually take the juice packet and squeeze it yourself into a glass. You didn't actually need the juicer. Imagine that. Do you know how much money went into investments? The VCs like Kleiner Perkins, which is the top name in Silicon Valley, Google Ventures, they all invested in Juicero. They saw the promise of innovation. Isn't this wonderful? $10 million. Just let that figure sink in for a second. $10 million for a juicer that makes juice out of packets that you could use. Like, two hands to squeeze out of. But that's pretty much, I would say, it's why this notion of innovation has become rendered ridiculous. Not because there isn't the promise. We could do so much more, but where we are choosing to invest and where the VCs are choosing to invest money and the talent is what is making it a topic of books like Adrian's.
Yeah.
So I will hand it off to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Thomas Mann House, and thanks to Magdalena for organizing all this. I think I'm very excited in this amazing environment to get to talk about this. And I have to say, I 100% agree. It's not that the products, Juicero is genuinely not innovative, but there are plenty of things that are being presented in Silicon Valley that are innovative in a way. The problem is that it's become a metonymy for innovation as such, right? To be innovative, for instance, in Germany, is to send people to Silicon Valley to find out how they do things. And what it is, as you're pointing out, a very narrow slice of, technological minimal risk-taking, funded by people who want a sure bet, or who are willing to tolerate risk and reward at very narrow ranges. And yeah, surely that sometimes produces innovation, but it produces a very small sliver of it. And there is this kind of scary tendency by the culture at large that I'm not even sure I blame Silicon Valley for, because ultimately these are magazines and newspapers that run the features that allow this to happen, and don't question some of these stories coming out of the Valley. That sort of say that this is the future, that this is the way innovation has to function. I think that's extremely risky, precisely because we face all these problems where, frankly, fixing them may not make anyone rich. It may make us all a tiny bit poorer, and that's a bummer. But it's ultimately, it needs to be done. It's like going to the doctor. So I think that part of what's scary is not that none of it's innovative. It's that it's blinding us to what avant-garde really could or needs to look like, right? What the whole range of possibilities is.
Can I add another layer to that? There's innovation, there's hype around innovation. There are just outright scams.
You're right.
So right now, Elizabeth Holmes is on trial for Theranos. It was supposed to be life-changing, game-changing. She was the future. She's on Forbes, a billionaire, the youngest self-made billionaire. She had everything, like Stanford dropout check. The board of advisors had folks like Henry Kissinger, and they had General Mattis and Eric Topol, the very credible scientist, researcher, cardiologist, checked off on her and said, this is so promising. And it all turned out to be, there was a lot of this veneer of respectability, credibility, and there were people who should know better. We looked to and say, the Stanford Associate Dean of Engineering was her advisor. So we said, it has to work, because people who are smart, who know about these things, we look to and say, these are the experts are telling us this is the right thing and the sure bet. And it turned out to be not. So I feel like that needs to be also called out, and today we'll focus on the more hype rather than the scam, but it just goes to show that the traditional institutions are not doing their job. Yeah. The governance bodies are also failing us. Which is why we need to work on more democratizing of information so everybody's better informed and making better choices.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting what you say, because if we look at innovation as a myth, as this big project, as this big idea that was like one of the founding ideas of Silicon Valley, I just wonder, is this part of our globalized capitalism, that it rewards these kinds of things, that it rewards a system that kind of creates credibility for someone like her? As you said, like everyone was on board. Everyone was a part of this kind of justification of her idea, and then it was brilliant. It was new. It seemed to be able to solve problems that are really that are urgent. Is it something that is part of the system? Silicon Valley, is it part of the system? I mean, you just mentioned that Stanford was a part of this too. Is this something that's just, I don't know, is it like an automatism that Silicon Valley rewards these kind of stories so much?
I mean, it's a good question, and I'm far enough from Palo Alto that I can speak freely about the complicity of my own institution. But I think actually in this case it is about a kind of attempt to make, I think the reason everyone looks to Silicon Valley is because it's the only place where capitalism can still promise us stuff, right? Everywhere else, it really feels like, we'll make things not worse, right? I feel like that's the best the car industry can do, right? Or United Airlines, they're like, oh, we'll offset this somehow. You're not actually killing anything. And that's basically, that's as utopian as that pitch gets. And this is where you can go, and capitalism still tells kind of big stories, the way it frankly habitually used to. And I think, and I think the hype machine is about the fact that a lot of attendant institutions, the university, but also media and politicians that sort of need to sell, oh, we're still a hub for innovation, kind of buy into hype rather than wanting to do sort of the hard work. One interesting thing about Theranos that always fascinated me, I was asked to do a story on them kind of when they were still riding high. I mean, like, it was by a German newspaper, so kind of late to the game, but not quite so late that the John Carreyrou article had come out that was like, they can't actually do any of this stuff. And so I asked a friend who worked at a, let's say, biotech company, yes, funded by a major internet company that is Google. And I said, do you guys worry about this at all? And they're like, well, yeah, if they can do what they say, we're very worried. And then they just said nothing more. And I think the implication was very clearly, well, we don't think they can do this, right? So they saw, right, these were doctors, these were, PhDs in molecular science. They all thought like this, either she's capable of magic or Elizabeth Holmes is lying to everyone. But of course, Henry Kissinger, is not a specialist in these things, and George Shultz, for all his diplomatic chops, was not not apparently specialized in plasma, and there was an element there of being taken in by the storytelling. And it's interesting. For the book, I looked through sort of how Theranos got covered, and there are a couple of pieces that are truly unfortunate, where people really sort of looked into the technology and said, this is extremely credible and this is amazing, this is revolutionary. But a lot of them just stayed non-committal. They said, if this should work, it would be amazing, right? And it's like, gee, that's an odd way of reporting, right? Like, if this war were to happen, it would be terrible. It's like, yeah, but how likely is that? What does it mean for my weekend? I feel like these are important questions that we want answers to. And that is the space of hype. Right? If this startup can do what it says, that would be amazing. Like, well, gee, you read their advertising prospectus. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say it can't do what they say. It's nothing. The ad for something always overpromises, right? It's this contentment to live in the hype, from politicians, from media, and frankly from academia. That is, I think, that does point to a kind of institutional failure there.
I would add on to it. It also highlights whom we consider experts.
Yeah.
It feels like there's a word I just came across, and there's actually a term for this, epistemological trespassing. Right. So you go from one, and I hadn't heard of this terminology. I said, oh, this is what it is when you are expert in just one area and you're actually pretending to be an expert in another. Like you said, what does Henry Kissinger know about plasma, for example? So that's such a great example. But what Elizabeth Holmes was able to tap into is a traditional notion what an expert looks like, feels like, hears like, right? So in the AI space, for example, if I were to ask, who are your top 10 experts? And even if I go put it into a search engine and say, okay, show me the top 10 experts, chances are it will show up 10 men.
Right.
Sure. And it can be Nick Bostrom or Jeffrey Hinton, and we have Andrew Ng. Credible men, very talented and qualified men. This is not casting aspersions on them, but we have many, many more women, Black women, feminists, non-binary, from the trans women. There are so many women out there who are doing incredible work, but we don't look at them as experts because traditionally that is not the face that we've been told is of an expert. So when Elizabeth Holmes taps into that psychology.
With her voice register that she intentionally lowered.
Yeah.
Indeed, and let's not forget the designer black turtleneck.
But still blonde hair, so the angelic features were there, so it was all very well thought of.
There is a theme there, and she played it to the T. She knew her audience, and the media is complicit in a way, and also victims in this case, because everything is about access journalism. Right. So if you want access to that news story, you have to play ball. The Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world know that, which is why I was extolling the virtues and the need for more investigative journalism, independent journalism, because access journalism gives us Theranos, gives us issues that we are seeing at Facebook, because you're dependent on the companies to give you information, and they will not give you the real story. That's where the role of independent journalism is so critical in this space.
Yeah. Also, I think, Mia, this is a good moment to talk more about your about Lighthouse 3 and also about women in AI ethics. I was thinking about, you were telling us the story before, how it all came to happen. And I just wondered, to found an initiative, and this is a couple of years ago, to found an initiative about women in AI ethics, I wondered, it's a rather specific thing. It's not women in tech, it's not women in coding. So I just wonder, maybe you can talk a bit about how that came to happen. So what made it seem so urgent to you to look at this specific era when it comes about inclusion and representation of a female force?
Sure, I'm happy to share that. So let me put you in my time machine, and we'll go back 15 years back when I arrived in Silicon Valley. Completely different space. eBay was the big kahuna. They were the big dogs, and they were Google's biggest search advertising customer. They had more clout than Google at that point. So you can imagine what the balance of power was there. So I moved from eBay, and then I worked for a series of tech companies. And I was helping them with a lot of the digital platform, because this was the push to social and this was a push to digital. Facebook was just, oh, here's a kid who's trying to do something with this platform he's got. Not many people connected the dots. All they thought was, oh, he's building an advertising platform, something with college students. The extent of his ambition was so, I think a lot of people missed it. Bezos, everybody thought at that time, was crazy because he was building warehouses. And you're thinking, this is a digital world. Why is this person, when he's had such a great success with books, moving into digital space? So everybody's watching this space, and the rest, as I say, is history. As we fast forward to, we knew what the end strategy was. We knew at that point what they were doing. But along the way, one thing I don't mention as often, I also was a tech blogger for many years. And I also, at that time, started running meetup groups. And so if I were to just sum up my career journey, it's two who's and a how. So the first who is, who's getting access to information. So when you work within tech companies, you are privy to a lot of information. Some is, of course, fed to you. But tech companies in Silicon Valley have the advantage. They're building all these products, and nobody on the outside knows like what's going on. How is this product going to help us, hurt us? So I run meetup groups. I've done over 100 events over the last 15 years with many different tech companies. And the mission of those, or the objective was, how do we get folks access to the information that they otherwise wouldn't? Because keeping all this information with the echo chamber of academia or tech is not serving anyone. So that was my first. So that journey began with those meetups. And then over the years, I was recruited at Google. And the interesting thing is search engine, their search engine, the Google search engine was one of the products that my team managed. And internally, at that time, no one actually believed that the search could be racist and sexist. And everybody actually believed that. They absorbed that. So we could keep moving through the journey. And then I left Google and I started Lighthouse 3. Again, working with tech, helping them adopt new technologies. But along the way, I came across these incredible women who were working in the space, but they were never recognized. And we could, either they were not included in a lot of the other conferences, so I would invite them to my events, that's one, because they were doing great work. They were not cited as much, they were not quoted as much, and from an academic perspective, you can see how that can be very challenging. So I looked at the second who, which is who is being represented, who is in the room, who are we paying attention to, and that brought me to the how, which was the Women in AI Ethics, the list, the directory. We send resources, we cover research materials specifically created by women, very simply because we want to change the narrative. We want to change who you think of as an expert, because there is expertise in those circles, in these communities. And ethics, because diversity is not a substitute for ethics. And we'll talk more about ethics later, but just wanted to say, people think we have hired a woman, check the box, we're ethical. No, if you hire someone to build a bomb, it doesn't matter what the person's ethnicity or what their gender is, you're still hiring them to build a bomb. So let's talk about the bomb. So that part was the ethics. So and that was a niche that nobody else was covering, because being a woman in tech is hard enough. Mm-hmm. Imagine trying to tell your boss that, no, what you're doing is unethical, the product you're building is unethical, so you need to stop. That is a very hard conversation. So our community is built to just help those women and give them the support and the resources they need so they can have those hard conversations. So love to, if that answers your question.
I think it's very remarkable. Also, if you say when you started out, there was hardly any representation. I mean, if you look at the discourse today, there's so much more awareness. There's also so much more female representation. There's a lot of, if you look at the universities, there's a lot of, the discourse has really expanded to really become more inclusive. And I also feel the pandemic acted a bit like a pressure cooker to really like conjure up new themes and to really like conjure up, and then Black Lives Matter happened, and then the change of government happened in the US and now in Germany, but that's a whole other discourse. And I just felt a lot of these things suddenly boiled up to come to the surface. And I just wonder if you look at the situation when you started out yourself and when you look at it now, are you more hopeful? How do you evaluate the situation?
Adrian and I talked about the optimism and the hopefulness that right now the way Silicon Valley operates is, it feels like they're using Black Mirror as their playbook. Are you all familiar with that show? It's like, what is the next dystopian thing, the worst dystopian product that we can come up with? So in the sense that there are women that I right now exist and I live and breathe at the same time as women like Dr. Timnit Gebru, who wrote the paper on the large language models and which she encouraged her employer, Google, to look deeply into what are the implications of these large-scale models that you're putting out there. These are unmanageable and they are environmentally, they can be disastrous. Are you looking into that? For that, she was fired. Her colleague, Margaret Mitchell, was fired. So I am grateful to be alive at the time as these women exist, that my work helps and supports that. But at the same time, I do feel we are lacking in protections for the women who speak up. There is a lot of momentum in that direction. And I do feel there's a lot of opportunity for us to do more there. Cautiously optimistic. Mm-hmm. If we do the right things, I believe we actually can do this.
Sounds good. So Adrian, from an academic standpoint, and as the director of the studies for gender research and sexuality, what is your take on this? I mean, did you realize? I mean, you came to Stanford in 2008. What do you watch with the discourses going on, especially among the female students at Stanford?
So I should say, and this is about tech and specifically, or more generally?
Tech related.
Or
a lot of it is like gender and tech, or feminist AI.
I should say that the reason I'm more hopeful now than I was when I started writing the book is because while representation doesn't replace ethics, it at least gets rid of a kind of groupthink and monoculture. And I think that's what happened in the last, when I first came to Stanford, especially sort of 2 or 3 years after, which was, I came during the financial crash, and then sort of, this was when Silicon Valley sort of refused to decline with the rest of the economy, and then sort of kind of went on this rocket ride, I think sort of 2011, 2012, right? And during that time, the kind of undergraduate who would be in my classes who told me they wanted to work in the industry was usually white men, but not exclusively. And they would say things like, well, I would like to, I would like to help make the world a better place, and that's why I want to work for Google. And I would just, my heart would skip a beat and say, I taught you Adorno. You should be able to see through this. Have I failed? Have I failed you as a teacher? And so I started writing these newspaper articles and related things that eventually would become the book, kind of in this total despair. And then what happened was that different students started showing up to my office hours and saying, I want to work in these companies. Students of color, a lot of women students, non-binary students, and students came back from these companies and said, yeah, I get it now. Like, I still like working here, but it's a company like any other and has some real problems. And here they are. And here's how, maybe not my class, but someone else's class, like, helped me think about this and helped me think about what's going wrong here. And it really informed my writing of this book. And that, I think when I first thought about, well, German professor writes about Silicon Valley, right? Like, there's an easy thing about, like, everything's terrible, the sky is falling, we're all going to be automata, the end, and I'm sure I'd get invited to some radio shows on the basis of that. But I didn't write that book because of the students that came back, where it became very clear, no, if you are conceptually sharp, if you ask the ethical questions, if you don't go in for the hype, there is stuff to change here. There's a lot of room for improvement. The monoculture of these companies really did a lot of damage, which, some representation, even minus the ethics, might already go some way to address, and then the ethics would hopefully be the next step. But there's really a lot of room for improvement here. And so I ended up, I definitely feel a lot more hopeful now. I don't know if I feel like massively hopeful. I do think that, I think that there are so many wonderful, smart, and politically far more and more savvy young people walking around Silicon Valley, and it warms my heart and it inspires me. But I also know that, compared to the, the massive, asteroid of cash that it heads for each of these people at all times, right? It can make the individual feel very, very small, right? Like, that in the end, the money wants to go a very particular direction. So on the one hand, I have a great deal of faith in a lot of folks in the Valley, especially the students, my former students, and people like them. At the same time, I wouldn't want to be in that fight. I'm glad I'm not. I do understand the temptations, and I understand that the force of investment wants to probably go a different direction. But at least we're not there where we were, I'd say, 10 years ago, where really people who should have known better just didn't.
What you said reminded me of my first day at Google. So when you join Google, they take you for orientation. They take like cohorts, and they take all the new Googlers who are nooglers, and they sit you into this room. And it's literally like indoctrination when you join a cult, where you're telling you like how much we love you and how wonderful it is to have you, and you're special. And in a way, everybody is. That they have a very high bar as to whom they recruit and who gets hired, and they tell you the percentages, like it's the 0.0001% of all the applications that they receive, and so you should be grateful, but you're special, the whole spiel. And this is something that stuck with me. What they said was, you will be working long hours, it's going to be very busy and stressful, but don't stress, okay? It's not like you're saving babies. That has stayed with me, and I feel like my journey of disillusionment with Silicon Valley might be traced back to that one singular moment.
Why? Why aren't we?
Right? You have the apparent, based on what you just said, here are all the smartest and the brightest and the best of the best, right? From the world over. We are not talking just California, we're not just the United States, we are talking from the world, and we're sitting in this room and we are not saving babies. Why?
What's wrong with this picture? Yeah.
and then they went on to say, hey, there's free food, we have the best chefs, and blah, 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 blah. And then people walk away to their jobs. And then 6 months later, you end up disillusioned because, oh my God, all we're doing is tweaking ad algorithms. We're just trying to sell more. Because when you peel away the veneer and the surface and get down to what is it that we actually do, what makes us the money, why are the algorithms designed the way they are, it all comes down to sell more.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say. I mean, if you look at these two things, like you felt like you were joining a cult, which in a lot of ways it is, and also deep down to even if you look at the new campuses that are built. I mean, they're even built like, I don't know, like sacred spaces, not like tech spaces. So there's a lot of like organic architecture, a lot of like things to make it look nice. So there's a shiny veneer, and a lot of things are made to, as you said, made to feel special. So there are all these layers of elitism in this, and I think it's very interesting. At the same time, and I would like to get a little bit more background from you guys about this, is the idea that that something like an algorithm could be objective, that it's not biased, that it's not discriminatory, that it doesn't include all these things that things like it doesn't recognize certain skin colors, it doesn't recognize certain people that are just outside the box, that just don't check the box. And on the other hand, you have deeply problematic things where algorithms suddenly are used to target things like sexual orientation or a certain demographic or whatever it is. We were talking about it before. Algorithms are used to hire and fire people. So it's not, a lot of these decisions are relegated to algorithms and are taken away from the human force, and that are implementing deeply problematic decisions. And so I just wonder these two things, like the myth of the recruiting, the myth of Silicon Valley, and then the myth of the seemingly objective tech. I just wonder where does this come from, and also is there a way to really make something like an algorithm more humane in a way, if at the same time it is implemented in so many more ways? I just wonder what your take is on this.
Well, I just wanted to actually, I mean, let me answer that question by going back to the previous one. I mean, the cultishness, I've not gone through this kind of orientation. I do want to point out that it reminds me of another slightly cultish American institution where one is told that one is special for being there, that there's a very low admission rate, and that one is better than people at some other randomly chosen likewise location across, you know, the Bay or the city or whatever. Maybe it's trying to set up a cult. It's a campus. It's trying to set up a university. It's trying to recreate someone's college experience. And one of the things, of course, that college is wonderful for is that it does disable sort of it disables the switch for consequences, right? You get to experiment, you get to have fun, you get to innovate, and it doesn't have to have these big ramifications. And I do wonder whether that's, you know, part of it is clearly that they're trying to recruit a young workforce. They're trying to sort of create a continuity because you're recruiting out of places like Stanford or Berkeley or whatever. The interesting thing, and there is also, I think, a labor aspect there, right? Which is to say, you don't expect to get paid to hang in your dorm with your friends and do a cool project, and you may not ask, wait, is my employer actually making money with this, and should I maybe get paid for the hours I'm putting in? It's like, no, we're just hanging out, we're playing foosball and talking about this thing. It's like, well, someone's going to make money on this eventually, but it sounds like it's not going to be you, right? So there's all that. But one other thing, of course, is I think it's meant to make the work less serious, and it does, I think, mean it doesn't disable that, but it discourages asking the serious questions about what kind of real-life consequences this has. Now, I can't speak to the question of whether the algorithm. It seems like, of course, you can make them more careful, more, you know, you can think about where you use them. You can be more thoughtful about that. It does seem to me that the kind of collegiate mentality of like, well, you know, we should do it because it's, you know, if it's not us, it's going to be the other team over there that's going to beat us at this or is going to get to it. That's definitely part of how I think things got done, where, you know, if you sort of confronted people with like, you know, you're building, I think you mentioned this earlier, you know, you're building, someone came up with a dystopian novel in the 60s that is based on this thing, and you went out and you built it, all right? The fact that isn't obvious to someone has to do with the way these companies are able to present themselves as still kind of less than serious, as somehow youthful, like needing to learn, needing to grow up. I mean, some of them are quite old by now, but there's a kind of all-round adolescence to that experience that I think is being cultivated and curated for some pretty serious ends, which is not to have to ask those questions.
I completely agree. It's a deliberate reprogramming so that you stop questioning. Because, when you're in a social setting, or just go back to the story, right? The emperor has no clothes. Why doesn't anyone question other than the young child? Because now they're not socially programmed not to ask questions. So I have noticed, so you asked me about Lighthouse 3 and what we do and what the approach is. So when I left Silicon Valley, the corporate world, I started this company and started working with the completely different type of client, which are financial institutions. And what the biggest difference is between financial institutions and tech companies is financial institutions are highly, highly regulated. So when you raise an issue about, hey, ethically this is wrong or whatever, they get on it, and they've been in trouble for it. And it's more refreshing to have, in some ways, even though it's seems more bureaucratic and more annoyingly cumbersome, still people are open to the idea of being questioned and stopped and think and make fixes. Tech companies, I realize the contrast right there is tech companies just run as fast as they can, and that is encouraged. Yeah. That is the ethos. And Tawana Petty, who is the director of Data for Black Lives, said it so well. She said, run fast, break things. The problem is what you're breaking now are humans. And therein lies the problem where tech is under so much scrutiny. It's no longer the good old heydays, and it's just advertising. Who's it gonna hurt? Yeah. And lo and behold, we're actually looking at the demise and attack on democracy fostered by the WhatsApp and the Facebooks. And all of a sudden you're like, here's a descent into fascism, authoritarianism, fueled by this really fun, cool platform that nobody was really paying much attention to. So it's gotten everybody's attention. So there's heightened awareness, which is great. And can algorithms be objective? The answer is unequivocally no. And I'll tell you why, because as much as they're presented as magical things and they are just these wonderful, perfect objects, they are designed by some human. There is a human sitting there making decisions. So we look at ethics as two things. There are consequences, like you said, and there are choices. Right. So it's a design choice. So the choices start with you decide what kind of algorithm I'm going to build today. I mean, what kind of system am I going to build? What problems am I going to solve today? So that starts with choice number one. You could choose to build something that's going to be an automated weapon, for example. And that will only hit maybe somebody you find annoying. That is a use of it, right? But is it ethical? No. So somebody needs to pull the plug right there. And right now there are developments on, you've seen the robot dogs? They're putting weapons on them now. Can anybody my gosh, we never saw that coming, yeah. Right? Shocking. How did that happen? So it's all fun and games until one of them starts chasing you down the road.
America and guns, that's just inconceivable.
It was such a shocker. Totally. So these human beings are sitting in a room. They all look alike, they think alike, they come from the same schools, they came into the same engineering schools, they even belong to the same clubs and same fraternities, and they're sitting there, and they're designing something that is meant for a single mother on food stamps. No context, no experience, but hey, it's technology, it's gotta be okay, right? But then they start working with data, because data is the lifeblood and the live stream. It's like everything in machine learning and AI works on data. Now, the data they pick is hugely flawed, hugely flawed. And the data is skewed against, say, the demographic that you're trying to supposedly help build this for. So you see how these choices they're making at every step of the way by the same homogenized teams leads to these consequences which are foreseeable, but not by the people in that room, right? Because it doesn't affect them. So if I unleash an autonomous robot dog with a gun on top in your neighborhood and I walk away, hey, it works, right? It does what it does, but I'm not asking you as a community, hey, how do you feel about it? You have this thing roaming about at night, And if you look suspicious, it's going to take you out. So that's where the discussion happens. So we are catching these things too late.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point, because this is something that made me think a lot about regulation too, because on the one hand you have, and this is not just happening here, but in Europe too, you have tech companies that are largely unregulated, so they can basically do what they want. And at the same time, you have, like, as you said, all these questions that are happening, that are very urgent questions. And the question is, so who actually facilitates and then enforces regulation, and what would that be? Is that only a governmental thing? Is that then only the old liberal paradigm of tech taking care of its own problems, which obviously it doesn't? And I think this is very interesting. I would like to really hear more from you, because this is such a pressing thing, and then it just happens. And if you talk to tech people, a lot of them say, "Oh no, if we regulate too much now, we'll stop progress." It's like someone said this to me. If you regulate something like algorithms now, it's like making a little child stop from learning to walk because it can only crawl right now. So he likened the state of the tech to a child that's crawling, which is bizarre, but then this is the argumentation.
The child with the bazooka.
Yeah. And I mean, one part of it that I find fascinating as someone who works, more largely with texts, is of course that AI, that there's a real blindness, it seems to me, in parts of the industry to understand that what corpora you train AI on will of course tend to reinforce biases and exclusions that exist in the corpora, right? So AI is, I have a colleague of this who works on this at Stanford, who shows that of course AI will always select a male image if you use the word doctor. How could they not? They're usually raised on large text corpora where historically that was the association, right? That's the AI is perfectly innocent. It's like, how could it have reached any other conclusion? And his point, which I really found interesting, is to say, gee, do you really think that doing that over and over again is going to lead to better results, or is it going to reinforce those results? So is this innovation actually bringing us, right, we're actually probably adding more to those corpora that would make them better if we were to train this AI 20 years down the line. But right now, it is actually reinforcing a status quo from a long, long time ago. And he says, well, gee, this isn't going to get better. If anything, it's going to be more intense. Unless you intervene, and I think he's thinking of internal regulation, but he says someone's got to regulate, someone's got to step in and say, like, we taught you wrong. This could be either picture, so please keep that in mind. But it's somehow this idea of they are in their infancy is actually really, really dangerous, because they're not as innocent as children, right? They're encoded with the sins of our past, ultimately, and will refine that into the future unless some kind of regulations. I don't know, I'm not enough of a technologist to know what that needs to look like, but it seems like someone has to step in and do something.
I totally agree. So one of the things that we try and focus on is this has been an evolution as a journey. So we started with the women in AI ethics and said, here are the women who are doing great work. Let's give them recognition. Here's the work they do. We realized that so many of these were just discussions and conversations and more discussions. And it got to a point like, who is going to do something about it? So the December 2nd event is very specifically focused on women who are working on regulation. For example, we have someone from ACLU who's going to talk about how do you write policy, how do you lobby your lawmaker to, say, ban surveillance technology, for example. The second is we are inviting Timnit Gebru. Dr. Gebru was fired, and now she's creating a new independent research institute, which does research outside of the tech influence and the tech bubble, so which is very promising. and we should all support that. And we have Ifeoma Ozoma, who was a whistleblower at Pinterest, was also fired, but she was a co-sponsor of a bill, Silence No More Act, which was signed by Governor Newsom recently. And she has been instrumental in making sure that we have protections for whistleblowers. So it starts right where the decisions are made, whether or not a technology should or should not exist, should we invest, right till the end it is deployed. What are the consequences if it gets deployed? And some of the issues that you run into is regulation needs to be enforced to actually mean something. And our past commissioner, Rohit Chopra, phenomenal, like a huge advocate for tech regulation and accountability. And he said, what's the point that, and he said it much more eloquently, but the bottom line is, what is the point of regulation? That even when Facebook or Google are found guilty, they get away with the tiny, like few million dollar fine, and these are billion, trillion dollar companies. This is just a rounding error. So what are they thinking? This is just a cost of doing business. So why would things change? So unless there's accountability and where they're like, if we do this, there will be consequences, meaningful, that might actually hurt our bottom line, because that's what investors talk about. I don't see a shift in change. We'll see more things like, let's just rebrand. Let's call ourselves, maybe, who knows, Meta. That sounds like a good name.
It's a meta decision.
Let's just change our name. Pretend this never happened.
Yeah.
We are not those people anymore. It's like being in a witness protection program, right? I did not murder that person, but I did turn evidence.
Except you still live at
good.
the same address over 8 square blocks, and you just
a new sign.
Yeah, new sign. Yeah.
So
it's interesting. Yeah, something that I also came across was being here, that a lot of, and I found this very interesting, there's a lot of initiatives, there's a lot of workshops, things that are tied to universities, things that are independent from it, things that are tied to institutions like museums, for example. And I found it very interesting. A part of my focus, a focus of my research here is the interdependence, the connections between art and digital technologies. And I find that a lot of people that are per se artists, or that go to UCLA, go to the arts department, they're very invested in what tech could be like and what it will become. And so I've recently been to a workshop at Occidental College, where college students really had a very hands-on approach of like learning to code, looking at not big data but small data. So small data was a very important thing, and to really enable themselves. And I felt, oh, this is interesting. It's really bridging different disciplines, different genres. It's bridging different discourses. And I wonder but then also this seems something, these are college students. I just wonder what your take on is, what your take on the bridging of a discourse is. I just wonder, if tech doesn't talk about it, the universities talk about it. I just wonder, do all these experts kind of like, are they in these like infinite loops talking to themselves, or how could we really broaden the discussion? I mean, you're trying to do it with women in AI ethics. Is there, how could this really be enforced? How could this really happen, that people are not just like looping themselves?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I do think that I have a lot of colleagues at Stanford who really do terrific work in this regard. I mean, my colleague Rob Reich just published a book and is giving seminars on it for folks in the industry. It's like, come join the Zoom, and and apparently it has hundreds of takers. So, and I think that there's a lot of hunger for it in the industry too. I mean, it is an industry that's pretty close to academia, right? People. It's not the car industry, right? Where I feel like the age profile is different, the educational backgrounds can be quite varied. It's I mean, for all the great dropouts that we think about, like Mark Zuckerberg and Elizabeth Holmes and Steve Jobs, at Google, I feel like almost everyone I've ever talked to has a PhD almost. It seems like, I mean, more than not. So I think that there are definitely avenues for exchange. I think the real kind of where it gets tricky is well, on the one hand, the work of regulation, and I think that there, I think California is doing a very, very good job currently, but it's just that politics, is by its very nature, pretty badly equipped to cut through hype, I would say, and so that makes this a little bit difficult, right? I mean, to see mayors jump onto the crypto train, you just kind of think, oh my goodness, could we get any less serious? That's really that concerns me greatly. The other thing I would say is I do also think that while like I don't want to say anything against the dialogue with the tech industry, but what I would say is to say that technology, it gets back to this question of innovation, right? Technology is not just a matter of industry, right? And innovation is not just a matter of industry, and part of what I would think I sort of call for in my book is to say, this is an industry like many others, like any others, right? Silicon Valley is a industry town, the same way Detroit is, the same way LA is in some ways, right? It deserves no more or less kind of myth making. There's some amazing things about it. There's some hilarious things about it. There's some truly depressing things about it. And it deserves a very kind of unvarnished look, just like any other industry. And I do think that I think it's great if artists engage with technology. I think it's important to not construe that as a dialogue with the tech industry, right? In some way, getting rid of some of that halo and saying there's technological progress to be made that no one's going to get rich off, and that's never going to be commercialized, and that isn't going to be on your iPhone, but that nevertheless makes lives interesting, better, different somewhere on the globe. That's an important space, and I think people in the technology space know that, but it's an important thing to kind of mark out and to sort of not say, this all has to go through industry, right? Because those mayors that talk about we need to become the crypto capital of the United States, what they mean, we've got to bring industry jobs here, right? And I don't know what that looks like, and I'm not going to contemplate it. But B, it's also just a failure of imagination. Crypto is an interesting technology. It's not an interesting industry. You don't want their headquarters in your, I don't understand what that does for you, right? So I think that's where I think we have to uncouple things pretty carefully.
That's interesting. I would also like to look at the role of the universities. I mean, as you've mentioned before, I mean, a lot of something like Stanford, the technology that is critiqued there and that is reflected on there also is developed there. And so I think this is something that is, I think, at least from a European or a German perspective, it's a very unusual thing to wrap our heads around. And I wonder, how is this? Let's take Stanford, for example, with Peter Thiel's large endowment to the university. And then also you're writing about Peter Thiel quite a bit. So I just wonder, how are the ties? Can a university actually have this, accept these kind of endowments of the industry, and then preserve a sense of independence at the same time?
On the individual level, I would say yes.
Individuals speaking for.
I think that there are very important critical voices coming out of a place like Stanford, independent of where the money comes from. On the institutional level, I'm not as confident, I have to say. I think but this is a problem for many universities. I think that as universities try to be more cognizant of the role they play, not just in question of social justice, although there, of course, as well, but also in questions of climate change, et cetera, where the money comes from can lead to some pretty large-scale decisions that the individual faculty member may not even notice, right? Where it's very clear that, oh no, well, we're not divesting, for instance. We're not, we're not going to use our large share in this company to push this board of directors to do something differently, to change their practices. So at the institutional level, I don't have a whole lot of hope at all. I think that, but I can only speak for the Stanford case because that's the one I know. Where I am quite worried, it's hard for me to see how many of our peer institutions aren't equally captured just by different creepy billionaires, I suppose. I think that this is a problem that the university has maneuvered itself into over the last 40, 50 years, where this became the main driver, and it has kind of shaped. Again, not, I don't want to allege in any way that I've ever been stopped from writing about, I didn't know that this particular individual was actually a big donor. I thought he invested in floating islands, but I guess maybe, but it has never sort of restricted me from criticizing him. But yeah, I do think that, does that mean that the university might not invest in a new school or a new program in X, Y, and Z, or might not use, or might be resistant to using its clout to push for something on a board of directors? I think so. I mean, it's definitely within the realm of possibility.
I have so many thoughts.
Please share them.
So going back to your previous question, I would say technology is too important to be left to technologists, period. It affects all of us. We all have a vested interest, making sure it's ethical, that's beneficial. And there is a very deliberate push from the industry and supported by academia to make ethics of AI, any technology ethics, to be a technical problem. So what it does is two things. One is they get to keep you outside of that conversation. If you're not a technical person, you obviously don't know what you're talking about, so you stay outside. So let the technology folks know, that engineers, the jocks, right? They're like, we got this, you shouldn't be questioning what we do. But what it also does, it frames this discussion into a way that the only people who can solve it are the people who created the problems. So you see a lot of reformed tech bros who created the problems, who designed these systems, who have gone out and now are getting more money to speak up against, and they're framing it as, if we only trained the engineers, if we just did more training and we only hired maybe a woman here, maybe a woman there, and we're good, right? Check, check. So it's a deliberate and intentional shifting and controlling of that narrative that we need to be very careful about. And the second thing is, if it affects all of us, we need to also open up this discussion outside of the ivory towers, outside of the bubble of academia and tech, because there is that very cozy relationship. Tech hoards money, has billions that they're hoarding and they're using for lobbying and so on. But then academia, if you look at the billions of dollars in endowment, the Stanfords and the MITs, the Yale, the question that begs to be asked and answered is, what is this in lieu of? Like, what is it what are you planning to do with these funds? Because the tuition isn't going down. Anybody has kids at Stanford or MIT, you're paying through the nose to send your kids there, and it's a highly selective process. So where is that funding going? What kind of conversations are being fostered? And our approach to that has been very simply that we need to educate people who are non-technical about why this is important, converting the technical, the obtuse conversations into real life examples, real life, something that actions, like what can they do in their roles? Because sometimes you just feel you are just on the outside looking in at all these people who control your destiny. They control whether or not you get a mortgage, whether or not you get into your kid gets into the right school. Do they get hired? Maybe their aspiration is to go to Google, but every step of the way, they control our lives. They're right here. They're sitting in our pockets. So how do we take the control of it? And I found that even in my professional life, I'm getting asked to talk more to the business folks, which is wonderful because they're starting to ask questions, and they should be asking questions right from the time. If you work in finance and you are a finance department of a company, you have a right to know like what algorithms are going to be used in your financial systems, or what are the different ways that bias enters into these systems. Whether if you work in, a great example is recruiting and hiring. I think that's a more disturbing use, because it's so easy for bias to creep into these systems. And I just did a workshop for a large financial institution. It was just interesting. And I said, let's do this exercise and say, can you identify how does bias enter an algorithm? And end of the day, there were like 20 different things and zip codes to which institution you went to, like your work history, because every one of that perpetuates some sort of bias there. So the more we can do to educate people who are outside the bubble, to ask questions, I feel that's one way and gets us to that better tech accountability that we are looking for. Because end of the day, let's face it, this is not just for the technologists to decide how to control us. It's up to us to decide how we want to be using these technologies for our benefit, for humanity's benefit. So how's on that note?
It's interesting to see this wide arc that we've opened up now. So I'm just thinking about the beginnings of Silicon Valley. I mean, we've talked about innovation. We've talked about things, how it happened. I mean, Silicon Valley started from people that considered themselves to be very much counterculture. There was a lot of hippie movement. There was a lot of DIY movement. And I just wonder, 40, 50 years later, what it has become. I just wonder sometimes, and I would really like to, like both of you to elaborate, can Silicon Valley itself solve some of the problems it created? Is there something like the going back to a paradise? Like, I mean, a lot of people, I talked to someone like Kevin Kelly. He was one of the founding members of Wired magazine. And he said, yeah, we were counterculture, and we were really trying to get these new tools that were to become the internet and give it to the people. So a lot of this was about empowerment. It was about breaking power structures. So pretty much the opposite of what happens today. So I just wonder, is there a way back to paradise, or was there never any to begin with?
Well, I think one has to go back before paradise, because of course, before the hippies, the Silicon Valley was essentially a, semiconductor manufacturer for the armed forces. Not necessarily not necessarily the most countercultural bunch. Although, I mean, I think the culture was always a little bit different. It was always a little bit, Wild West and creative, but on the basis of a fairly, traditional industry, which mostly employed women. Which in fairly menial and repetitive and I think also unhealthy tasks. I don't have any data on this, but I know that Silicon Valley has a shocking number of Superfund sites. So the things that they were working with to make and test these things were not actually particularly harmless. And I think in some way the countercultural moment clearly sort of is baked into the DNA of the place, but it's a somewhat later addition. So I think that my instinct, just looking at that long history, since you brought it up, my instinct is to say, I think it's always been compromised, and that's not terrible. I mean, I don't know which industry has been an unalloyed force of good ever. So maybe looking to them to fix it is always going to be a little bit naive, and really needs to be done by a broader society. So that would be my answer to that question. That I think that there are definitely moments of genuine utopian promise within that story, and I think we should take that seriously and we should celebrate that. But they are not the beginning of the story. They sort of are blips in the middle, in between making money of exploiting one group of people and then making money exploiting another group of people, and then and now a third, right? Like I would say that those might give us a sense of where things could go, but I don't know if the industry is ultimately the best guardian or the best custodian of those moments of promise.
But then also the question is, could something like green tech, green industry, green globalization be the answer? I mean, California was, or it's even is, if you look at from a perspective from Germany, looking at California with like, oh, they have electric cars, and there's like so many things that we want in Germany, to focus it on that. I just wonder, could that be the answer to really like enforce also with the innovations of Silicon Valley and enforce a new level of consumerism, like the conscious consumerism. I mean, something that I realize here is like every purchase you make is about conscious decision and is about sustainability, and a lot of it is just a lofty promise. So I just wonder, could this be something? I mean, it really was an alternative idea for a while to like the green consumerism and the green tech.
I'm smiling because I was reading about this really pitched as innovative carbon capture technology, which showed up in my feed someday, and I'm thinking, I think that's called a tree.
Right.
This answer from Silicon Valley, which is fascinating. When you take a step back, it's like, we'll solve the problems of technology with more technology. So we talk about Tesla. I'm not a huge fan of the company for multiple reasons, and which not as much to do about clean tech or just environmentally friendly vehicle, but just problematic in the ethos of the company and the culture. But that's a story and discussion for another day. But really, is the solution to our environmental challenges more cars on the road? Because that addresses such a tiny, tiny portion, because it then, in a way, it gives us, it enables us to say, ignore all the other issues, right? So we say, I did this one thing, I have an environmentally friendly car, and that makes me, that's an ethical choice, disregarding the impact on human rights, the Congolese miners who are actually getting the silicon for your lithium batteries, for example, in really brutal conditions, and you don't even consider like the traffic issues that is causing, not to mention just the technical issues and other what's happening with the workforce. But really, I feel like any solution needs to be more comprehensive. These band-aid fixes is what got us to the place where we are. And to your previous question, I did want to mention something. I don't know how many folks here know that there were way more women, female programmers back in the day. Yeah. There's an actual book about how bad policy and patriarchy and sexism pretty much drove them out of the industry.
Mar Hicks's book, right?
Mar Hicks's book. It's just brilliant in that.
Programmed inequality, right?
Yeah. Bing, thank you. I was just especially
excellent book. So.
It is, and they were paid less, and the pay scale, went up when men started doing the job, and they've shown consistently any job that women do, the pay grade goes down. And if a man does it, so right there, there's inequity that's built in, and you see that in tech over and over again. So that's something, unless we address that core component, I don't think we'll see that promise as we talk about. And one last point about what happened in the good old days. So that was one of the examples, but internet, if you think about where it all started, which was a DARPA initiative. So there's always the defense advanced research project, and there was always this close connection between Silicon Valley and defense and military, and they pretty much shut down any dissenting voices, which were, whether it's surveillance tech, any kind of unethical uses. So what we're seeing is we're just going around in cycles and circles, and maybe it's time that we broke that cycle. I wouldn't go back to the good old, not so good old days, I would say we've been there, we've done that, and that hasn't worked well. So how do we create a new and better future?
So I don't know, I feel like I have a bunch of answers and they're kind of contradictory. I just have very complex feelings about both green tech and its promises, because on a very simple and very human level, I want to believe them, right? I mean, like, I think that's the problem with it, right? That like, I understand that what's being promised to us is a lifeline, and the alternative to it is pretty horrible to contemplate. I do think that there is another element. I find I don't know if I would look to. I think that California is a leader on all these things, and I think one should look to California. I'm not sure one should look to Silicon Valley necessarily. The thing that I'm starting to, I got really moved by recently is that, unfortunately, I think the city is going to waffle on this again, but San Francisco has sort of decided to let the Great Highway, which runs right by, it's Route 1, runs right by Ocean Beach, to basically eventually abandon it and to say this, the ocean's going to claim this is going to happen. And we're going to have to deal with the consequences. And we're done tinkering, fixing our way out of this problem. It's time for humility. And we reaped it, now we sow it, right? And we figure out socially how can we make sure vulnerable communities aren't targeted by this, because of course it's always, we know who's going to get hurt by this and who is well insured by federal flood insurance or whatever, right? Like we've lived in this country long enough to know what this is all going to look like, and I do think that that's it doesn't have to always be that grim, but I do think some version of humility is, and I think that there's a lot of that in California. I think that's really wonderful. I do think this kind of manic, oh, what about this technology thing is the opposite of that. It's this weird form of bargaining that is ultimately is contrary to that spirit. And I think that if we can come up with innovation that forestalls some of the worst, or that really allows us to go carbon neutral or whatever, that's all great. I do think that that's my big problem with Elon Musk. I must admit I have Elon Musk's solar panels on my roof because I'm a sucker for this kind of technology. But it's the messianic promise of it, right? It's the fact that this is going to fix it. It's like, no, right? Something likely will have to be given up. There's something that I enjoy that I shouldn't be doing anymore, and maybe I will find after a year of pandemic that I don't actually miss it that much, right? Academics like me are very much taught that, and I think on the West Coast this is maybe even stronger, right? That to be important, you have to not be where you teach, right? Like you have to always be on the road somewhere, right? Oh, I'm getting an award in Castile, and then I have to go to Paris to for a conference and whatever, right? And I'm really starting to think that there's a book by a colleague at Notre Dame, Roy Scranton, who calls it "Learning to Die in the Anthropocene." That part of it is to say, yeah, I would be so honored to be there. I'm not going to be there because I can't justify it, and yeah, I'm gonna be bummed, and but I think there is an element here where we need to be able to learn to do less, and maybe it is really about learning to die. And Silicon Valley, it's so significant to me that the one thing Silicon Valley is looking to abolish more than anything, it's dying, right? Like every Silicon Valley billionaire, as a rule, is trying to figure out how to live forever. That's like they're, you get them 3 glasses into the Chardonnay, and they're like, here's the thing that I'm really interested in. It's like, it's going to be about how you don't want to die, right? I think that's which is, I know who does, but I do, who wants to think about that? But I do think it's so telling that they sort of close their eyes. They're so good at solving problems like, I have lost my car keys, can you unlock my car? But they have such trouble with the question of, I think the way I'm living on this planet is killing this planet. What must I do, right? And they're like, here's a gizmo. It's like, no, that's not answering the question that was asked.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving a highlight into these ambiguities and also into these ambivalences. I think this would really lead me to the last question for today before we open up the forum for questions and remarks. I wonder, obviously, being here in this space for transatlantic debate that we obviously engage in, I wonder, all these things that you talk about, Adrian, really makes me think of this like hype in Germany, where it's like 5G for everyone. It's like the golden calf, and it's like the get more, and we mustn't be left behind. Germany must catch up, like the catching and the hunt. I mean, the metaphors for this kind of state of mind that is fostered really right now, independent of government, as we see right now. I really wonder, asking both of you, is there something that can be learned of the maybe failed experiment or flawed thing that is Silicon Valley for Germany, for Europe?
I have to say how much I agree with what you said about needing to do more deeper introspection, that the answer may not be just another widget, just another gadget. So I'm going through a very I've undertaken a personal social experiment. To your point about what can you live without, and I'm consciously making a decision. So I have not used Amazon, not bought anything from Amazon for years now. And the reason I did it just to show myself and prove that it is doable. There are things that we feel that we cannot live with or live without, and you'll be surprised. I got rid of my car. I had a German car for the last 15 years. And I did, and I take public transportation. Again, it's just an experiment. We think there are so many things in life we couldn't do without, and you'd be shocked that these are expectations that we set up, and those are the expectations that these tech companies and corporations have set up for us, saying that no, you do need all of these things that we are giving, all the gadgets that Adrian alluded to, they're throwing at us, because if you don't, there's something wrong with you, and there isn't really. So if there's one thing we could take away from Silicon Valley, it's literally this notion that every technology problem can be solved with more technology. Yeah. Maybe this solution is something that's totally non-glamorous. Maybe the solution is a tree. Why not look outside of that bubble and think about, is there a non-technological solution to this problem that we're trying to solve? And look at from ethics as not, this is good, this is bad, versus what are some of the consequences? Who's going to bear those consequences? And are we making the choice to benefit the maximum number of people? Where Silicon Valley is engineered, the algorithms are engineered at maximum clicks and maximum sales, and these are not the right metrics. So if we were to take away, from my perspective, anything, it's just this, change those metrics, look back at your values. What do you value? And does your choices reflect those values? And the companies that you choose to do business with, do they then reflect your values? And just expand our thinking a little bit, go a little deeper and go a little broader outside that bubble.
Yeah, I mean, just I fully agree. And there's this is a nice little data point. I forgot what this startup is called, but a few weeks ago, I was walking my dog in San Francisco, and the bus drove by with an ad that said, "Your groceries in 15 minutes, or they're free." And I thought, what? I can wait the extra half hour? I mean, that is demented, frankly. I'm sorry, but 15 minutes. I mean, like, yes, if I'm in the middle of frying a pancake and it really strains, right? And someone thought this was an ad that would make someone go, finally, someone has understood what ails me. It is that my groceries take 20 minutes rather than 15. It just seemed, I think that there's something.
Yeah, and this is also the latest hype in Germany now, like the pandemically driven thing of have your food delivered and have it delivered in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and there's this whole thing of like
a
precarious
meal
workforce.
I can get if you're hungry enough, okay, but these are groceries. It just seems, I guess solutionism is the word for that, right? It's like answer to a question that no one asked. But in terms of what I think places like Germany can take away from it is, I'm going to give a kind of small C conservative answer to that. It's that Societies develop, it's kind of a Edmund Burke answer. Societies develop their social, their political mechanisms and customs over time. If someone else, just because someone else has a shiny object to show you is not a reason to necessarily chuck that overboard. It might be more likely than not, not. There's something, and it's important to look at things, look at how power is distributed, look how capital flows, and ask yourself, am I looking at the solution to the future, or am I looking at a problem, right? I do agree that there are things in Silicon Valley that to me look like the future and to me look like solutions, that to me, including Elon Musk's solar panels, which I am a believer in somehow, in spite of myself. But I do think that, I get asked two questions a lot in Germany. How can we have companies like this? How can we have companies like Uber? Why don't we have that? How can we have a university like Stanford? Why don't we have that? And I think the answer is the same, right? You can have a university like Stanford tomorrow. You just lower estate tax to nothing. You fail to enforce it pretty much completely. You make sure that intergenerational wealth is really the only way to get ahead. You really want to try and destroy the planet another 10 to 20%. You want to shred your social safety net. And yeah, I think you can have enough rich people to build you all these fancy buildings, right? The question is, do you want to live in a society that you've just created? Congratulations, you've engineered it, but is this what you wanted? And I think that some version of this is true for Silicon Valley too. The amount of VC money that is creating a lot of these problems, frankly, I think that we've been identifying. This is not the company's fault. There are a lot of people who want to do interesting work. It's the people funding them that often are creating these monsters. And there are other people who are okay with less return on their investment, who are funding companies that we've never heard of and that do interesting work, right? But they're not the ones that I get asked about in Germany. Those started as family investment instruments for the Rockefellers and places for families like that, right? That's part of the answer, right? Create essentially, truly yawning wealth gaps, and this might happen to you. Question is that? Do you want it that badly? Do you want, free burritos and, getting to ride your scooter from office to office? Is that worth destroying all that these other things for? I think it's really important to not sort of think innovation is driving all this. Innovation drives some of it, but untrammeled global capital is and I'm only talking about the American money here. We aren't even talking about the sovereign wealth funds and et cetera, that come out of even murkier sources, where it's literally the human rights abuses are happening right now, and then the money is being funneled into these companies. So I do think it's just worth asking. And then I think there is something to learn from Silicon Valley, because there are, I think, investors that are trying to do the right thing. There are companies that are doing the right thing, but they're probably not the ones sitting in the shiny office at one hacker away, right? They're probably not the ones with the, Norman Foster designed, or the loop or whatever. It's probably a small garage with a bunch of weirdos working stuff out, and stopping themselves when they say, I think this is going in a weird direction, and getting funded by their friends sort of out of pity. And yeah, find these people, ask them. But every time I see another delegation from Germany go through Silicon Valley, they make the same 4 or 5 stops, and it's never anything like this. It's always, it's going to be, we can probably predict it. It's going to be Facebook, it's going to be Google, it's going to be Y Combinator, and then maybe you go on top of the Salesforce tower just because the view is great, right? Don't do that anymore. Avoid all those places and start going other places, I guess would be the other piece of advice.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting so many things and for really taking a deeper look into a lot of the ambivalences and ambiguities and also the hopes and dystopias of Silicon Valley. I think this is a great moment for me to say thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks my guests, and thanks for the night. Thank you.